Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is a journey into a quieter corner of the past, where stories are not loud with battles or victories, but soft with the small rituals that came before an ending. History, after all, does not always roar, it often whispers. Before we step into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so that these forgotten mysteries can drift a little farther, maybe even reaching others in your family who need a gentle way to fall asleep. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see those tiny lights glowing on a map across the world, each one of you listening quietly, together, though apart. The wind moves endlessly across the steppe, brushing over grass that has no beginning and no end. If you stand there long enough, you feel small, as if the earth itself is too vast to be touched by human hands. In this world of horizon and silence, there are no castles, no great walls, no marble palaces, only sky, grass, and the unbroken rhythm of hooves. It was here, in this sea of emptiness, that the story of death on a scale the world had never seen was born. The Mongolian steppe is not gentle. Winters cut the land with sheets of ice, and winds so sharp they strip skin raw. Summers offer little reprieve, the heat pressing down like a weight, the sun relentless, the water scarce. Those who survived here were not nurtured into softness. They were hammered into something harder, something unyielding. The people who roamed these plains carried no illusions of permanence. They moved with the herds, with the seasons, and with the promise that tomorrow could take everything away. To live here was to understand hunger, thirst, and the delicate balance between life and sudden death. Horses were more precious than homes, for homes could be abandoned, but a horse was freedom. Milk, meat, and movement came from them. Without a horse, a man was nothing, a shadow left behind in the grass. Children were taught early to ride, not because it was a skill, but because it was the only way to survive. By the time a boy's legs could grip a saddle, he was expected to move as one with his animal. The land was vast, and a slow man was a dead man. It is difficult, from the comfort of cities and walls, to imagine what this life forged in the human spirit. The Mongols did not grow up fearing hunger. They grew up expecting it. They did not dread raids or violence. They sharpened their blades for it. Their world was not made of certainty, but of cycles, of movement, of revenge, of sudden storms and sudden deaths. And from this crucible of unforgiving nature, a boy named Temujin would emerge. But before he bore the name that would make the world tremble, before his empire of death took shape, the steppe itself had to awaken. The Mongolian plateau in the 12th century was not united. It was a landscape of scattered tribes, each clutching to survival, each wary of the other. Alliances formed and shattered like ice on a river. Betrayal was common currency, loyalty was fragile, and blood spilled easily across the grasslands. One season a neighbour might be a trusted ally, sharing horses and protection. The next, that same neighbour might ride under the cover of night, burning tents and carrying off livestock. This constant uncertainty hardened the clans, shaping them into people who trusted only strength. What the rest of the world often forgets is that the Mongols were not destined for empire. They were not blessed with fertile valleys or endless rivers. They did not build cathedrals or carve monuments of stone. They were overlooked by great civilizations to the south and west, dismissed as barbarians chasing goats across an endless plain. China had its Great Wall, Persia its gardens, Europe its feudal kingdoms, and the steppe was thought to be nothing, an empty wilderness populated by wandering horsemen. Yet in that emptiness, something more terrifying than marble cities or fortified castles was forming. The endless steppe does not celebrate peace. It whispers of struggle. It rewards the cunning, the relentless, the ones who can bend hardship into weaponry. Every child who grew up there carried the weight of generations hardened by storms and scarcity. By the time Temujin was born, this world had already carved him a destiny. He did not inherit vast lands or treasures. He inherited the silence of the grasslands, the bitter lessons of betrayal, and the unshakable knowledge that only those who strike first endure. The land itself felt alive in its cruelty. Wolves circled the edges of encampments, scavenging for the weak. Rivers froze solid, turning water into an unreachable promise. Herds could die in a single storm, leaving entire families on the brink of starvation. Death was never far, and so the Mongols treated life as something fierce, something to defend without hesitation. A man who lost his herds, his bow, or his horse had little left to cling to. Those who survived learned to see opportunity in chaos. They learned to take what they needed when fortune allowed it, and to strike before fortune turned against them. It was this constant dance with the death that shaped a people who would one day unleash death upon the world. But in the beginning, before empires and blood-soaked campaigns, the steppe was simply a cradle of survival. The Mongols sang songs to their herds. They whispered prayers to the eternal blue sky. They celebrated births, mourned deaths, and moved ceaselessly across the grasslands, never lingering long enough to imagine permanence. Theirs was a world where tomorrow could erase everything, and so every choice carried the weight of survival. And in that fragile balance, a storm was gathering. Temujin's birth was not marked by prophecy in stone or stars carved into temples. It was marked by the ordinary struggles of a nomadic family, tents that swayed in the wind, herds that needed tending, enemies lurking just beyond the horizon. Yet the land seemed to know what it was giving rise to. The winds howled across the plains with restless energy, as if even the earth understood that the silence of the steppe would not last forever. For centuries, the steppe had watched civilizations rise and fall at its edges. It had seen caravans move slowly along the Silk Road, heavy with silks and spices, guarded by mercenaries. It had watched as empires to the south built walls to keep its riders at bay. The steppe remained patient, untamed, waiting. But when it finally awakened in the hands of a boy who learned to ride before he could read, who learned to kill before he learned to count, the world would remember it not as empty land, but as the birthplace of terror. The endless steppe awakens not with a roar, but with silence. With the slow gathering of clans, the sharpening of arrows, the forging of bonds, and the breaking of trust. In this vast, merciless expanse, a story begins that will not end with the survival of one tribe, but with the deaths of tens of millions. The grass hides no monuments, no ruins, no grand palaces, but it hides the roots of an empire that would stretch from the Pacific to the heart of Europe, leaving behind a trail of ash and bone. The land itself seemed to breathe, and with it, the destiny of its people shifted. Soon the horsemen of the steppe would ride out, and the world would learn that the silence of the plains had never been empty at all. It had only been waiting. The winds that rolled across the steppe carried no mercy for children. Life here did not ask if one was ready. It simply demanded endurance. Among the scattered yurts and restless herds, a boy named Temujin entered the world in the most fragile of circumstances. His father was a Khan, yes, but only of a modest clan, powerful enough to inspire envy, yet too small to guarantee safety. The boy's first cries rose into a world where betrayal always lingered close, and where the strength of family could be shattered in a single poisoned meal. Temujin's earliest years were marked by motion, hooves drumming against the soil, the flicker of campfires at night, the sight of strangers whose smiles hid daggers. His father, Yasugai, carried him proudly, imagining a future of alliances and strength, of herds multiplying and warriors gathered beneath his banner. Yet power on the steppe was never fixed. What seemed secure could vanish in a heartbeat. When Temujin was still a child, Yasugi was betrayed. Invited to a feast among rivals, he drank the airag that had been poisoned. By the time he staggered back to his family, the strength of his body was already failing. Death arrived quickly, as it so often did in the steppe, and with it the unravelling of everything his household depended on. A Khan's family without its leader was no longer a household of power, but prey. The boy who would one day rule an empire suddenly found himself stripped of protection. His mother, Hoilun, was left with a brood of children and no allies willing to risk their fortunes on a widow's fate. In the cruel arithmetic of survival, her family became a liability. Their clan, once bound by loyalty to Yasugai, abandoned them. One by one, warriors and herds drifted away, until the widow and her children were left alone in the vastness of the grasslands. To be abandoned on the steppe was almost a death sentence. The wolves that circled at night were not only animals but the hunger of other clans, the greed of raiders, the silence of the cold. Hoelun and her children scavenged what they could. They dug wild roots from the soil. They trapped fish in frozen rivers. They learned to eat whatever the land reluctantly gave, from the marrow of bones to the husks of berries. Survival was not nourishment. It was a fight against starvation day after day. Temujin grew up knowing hunger as intimately as breath. His hands became calloused, not from luxury, but from scraping frostbitten bark. His childhood was not filled with toys or lessons of nobility, but with the weight of desperation. The wolves howled at night, their cries echoing across the empty plain, and in those sounds was a cruel reflection of his family's fate. They too were prey, cast out, waiting to be torn apart by stronger mouths. Yet something in the boy hardened against that fate. The abandonment that might have crushed another instead carved him into something sharper. Where others learned resignation, Temujin learned vigilance. He studied the way his mother endured, how she held her children together with fierce resolve, never allowing despair to take root. He understood that no hand would save them, no neighbour would ride to their defence. Survival would come only from their own will. The family's hunger sometimes turned inward. Brothers quarrelled over scraps. Blood kin became rivals for survival. In one of the darker turns of his youth, Temujin clashed violently with his half-brother Bekta. The struggle for food, for dominance, for the fragile thread of control ended with Temujin taking his brother's life. It was not a grand act of conquest, but a grim reflection of the world the steppe had made. Here, weakness was not merely dangerous, it was fatal, even within one's own bloodline. The boy's eyes, still young, had already seen too much of betrayal, starvation, and death. Yet they carried no softness. Each wound to his family became a lesson. Each night spent trembling in hunger became a vow. If the steppe was a place where only the strongest hand could survive, then his hand would one day be the strongest. And so, in the silence of exile, the child abandoned to the wolves began to shape the instincts of a conqueror. He learned to hide his weakness, to mask his hunger, to wait for the right moment to strike. He listened to the voices of the land, the winds that never stopped moving, the cries of animals that lived and died with no lament. He absorbed the hardness of the earth into his own spirit, and where others saw despair, he saw training, but the steppe did not let him grow in peace. Raiders sometimes appeared on the horizon, men whose faces carried greed like a shadow doe. Temujin learned the sound of hooves that meant danger. He knew the way his mother's voice tightened when she spotted riders in the distance. Sometimes they fled into forests. Sometimes they hid in ravines. Life was a cycle of concealment and sudden terror, a childhood made of vigilance rather than innocence. And yet through this harsh apprenticeship, the boy gained something rare: the knowledge of how it felt to be powerless. Later, when he commanded tens of thousands, this memory of abandonment would never leave him. He would know exactly what it meant to be cast aside, to starve, to face the wolves with no one to call for. Perhaps this is why his vengeance, when it came, would be so absolute. The wolves of the steppe are clever hunters. They wait until the herd scatters, until the weak stumble, until the cold slows the blood. Then they strike as one, merciless and efficient. The image of those predators circling the campfire's walls seared into the boy's mind. In time, he would become something greater than the wolves, a hunter who turned the same merciless logic of survival into the foundation of conquest. But for now, he was still a child, shivering under the vast sky, abandoned to a world that wanted him gone. His family gathered close, fires flickering against the wind, their shadows long and fragile in the grass. Every night could have been their last, every day a borrowed gift, and yet, somehow, they endured. From that endurance, something darker and stronger was born. Temujin's heart beat in rhythm with the land, a place that devoured the weak, but sharpened the ruthless. The boy abandoned to the wolves would not only survive, he would learn from them. And one day, he would lead his riders across the earth with the same hunger, the same cold efficiency, until millions would know what it meant to be prey. The boy who had grown up in hunger and fear began to carry himself differently as he entered his youth. His shoulders, once bent under the weight of cold and starvation, straightened. His eyes, sharp as the hawks that circled above the steppe, carried no softness. Life on the plains had stripped him of illusions. He had seen betrayal, tasted desperation, and shed the blood of his own kin. Such experiences did not fade like memories. They became the marrow of his being. Temujin's world was one where strength spoke louder than compassion. A child who hesitated lost his share of food. A man who failed to protect his herds lost his livelihood. A family without a leader was reduced to prey. In such a place, mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and weakness was swiftly punished. And so the boy grew into a young man with no space for hesitation. His will, like the bow he carried, was drawn tight, ready to release without pause. He had already learned to live with less than nothing. His body carried the scars of starvation, his stomach accustomed to meals that others would not call meals at all, strips of dried roots, scraps of meat too spoiled for rivals to keep, fish pulled from half-frozen streams. But his spirit, rather than wither, had hardened. Each day of survival sharpened him, and within that sharpening, something far more dangerous began to form: resolve. Temujin was not content with mere endurance. He saw how easily his family had been abandoned when his father died, how quickly loyalty had crumbled. The lesson was etched deeply into him. Trust was fragile, and kinship alone could not hold men together. If he were to lead, it would not be through the bonds of tradition or fragile promises whispered over campfires. It would be through fear, through loyalty bought by strength, and through a will so unbreakable that no betrayal could topple it. The steppe offered constant reminders of this truth. Clans clashed in sudden raids. Alliances shifted as easily as the winds that bent the tall grass. One day a neighbour shared salt and milk. The next, that same neighbour might cut your throat. Temujin studied this chaos not as a victim, but as a student. He learned when to strike, when to hold back, when to let an enemy grow overconfident before taking everything from him. Even as a youth, he showed a patience that was rare among the horsemen of the plains. He did not fight only to survive the moment. He fought with an eye to the future. One story from his youth revealed the steel forming within him. Captured by a rival clan, his hands bound, Temujin faced a slow death. Yet he watched, he waited, he listened, he studied the habits of his captors, the moments when their attention wavered. And when opportunity came, he broke free, killing his guard and fleeing into the night. It was not only strength that saved him, but an instinct for timing, an ability to read the smallest weakness in others and turn it to his advantage. The boy who had once been prey was learning to become predator. Still, even as his will hardened, he carried an understanding of dependence. He had seen his mother hold the family together through sheer force of spirit, guiding them through years when survival seemed impossible. From her, he inherited not gentleness, but a recognition that unity, however fragile, could make the difference between life and annihilation. He would carry this lesson into adulthood, shaping it into a weapon. Where others ruled by bloodline or by fleeting friendships, Temujin began to envision a power that was bound by something deeper. Loyalty forged in shared struggle. Loyalty that could be severed only by death. It was during these formative years that his will transformed into something unyielding. Hardship no longer felt like misfortune. It became training. Hunger was not simply suffering. It was a teacher. Betrayal was not an end. It was a reminder that trust must be earned and maintained with iron. He absorbed each wound, each scar, as if they were steps leading him toward an unseen destiny. When he looked at the clans around him, Temujin saw not communities, but fractured pieces waiting to be assembled. He recognized their rivalries, their envy, their fears, and he began to imagine how they could be harnessed. He understood that men followed those who could provide security, who could protect their herds, who could promise spoils greater than their enemies could offer. His mind, sharpened by suffering, began to calculate how such power might be seized. The young man was not yet a Khan. He was still a figure wandering the grasslands, gathering strength, finding allies where he could. Yet those who met him often spoke of his intensity. There was no softness in his gaze, no hesitation in his speech. He carried himself with the gravity of someone who had endured abandonment and would never allow it to happen again. To follow him was to be bound to a leader who would stop at nothing, who would not be swayed by pity or by doubt. Such determination, born of hunger and exile, would grow into the ruthless will that defined him. This will was not loud. It was not the boastful arrogance of a chieftain drunk on temporary victories. It was quiet, patient, relentless, like the endless winds of the steppe that never ceased their movement. Temujin's will became a force of nature, one that wore down enemies, broke resistance, and drove his followers forward even when exhaustion threatened to consume them. And while his power was still small, his ambitions reached far beyond the horizon. He had seen firsthand the fragility of families, the futility of alliances, the weakness of scattered tribes. The world beyond the steppe might still dismiss him as a wandering youth among horsemen, but within his heart, a vision was beginning to take shape. A vision of uniting the fractured clans into one, of transforming hunger into conquest, of turning the chaos of the plains into the order of an empire. It was not kindness that would bind men to him. It was fear of betrayal, fear of abandonment, fear of becoming prey to stronger hands. Temujin's will was forged in the knowledge that mercy had no place on the steppe. His destiny would not be to endure like his ancestors, eking out survival among wolves and rival clans. His destiny would be to become the storm that swept across the grasslands, pulling every rider, every blade, every family into his orbit, or destroying them outright. Thus, the boy hardened by hunger, the youth who killed his own brother, the captive who broke his bonds, became something new. He became a will given flesh, a resolve that could not be bent. And from that will, a force would rise that would one day drown kingdoms in fire and silence. The endless steppe had carved its lesson into him, and he would carry it forward until the world itself bent beneath it. On the steppe, where alliances shifted like the wind, loyalty was a fragile thing. Trust could not be bought with words alone. It had to be sealed in blood, bound by ritual, made sacred through the promises of warriors who knew that betrayal was as common as breath. Among the nomadic clans, the act of swearing brotherhood was not a gesture, but a covenant, a bond meant to carry more weight than family ties. For Temujin, who had grown up abandoned and betrayed, such oaths became both a necessity and a test of survival. As his youth hardened into manhood, he began to gather companions who saw in him something more than an ordinary chieftain's son. His resolve, his ability to endure, and the clarity with which he pursued power drew others toward him. Among these allies was Jamuka, a boyhood companion whose destiny, for a time, ran alongside his own. The two swore an oath of Anda, brotherhood for life, mixing their blood as a seal that their fates would remain bound together. In the emptiness of the steppe, where clans rose and fell like grass before the wind, this act was meant to be unbreakable. The ritual itself carried weight older than either of them. Warriors would kneel, share the same cup, speak the same vows, and in doing so, declare that no betrayal, no conflict, no ambition could divide them. And Anda was not a mere friend, he was another self, a man to be trusted more than a brother born of the same mother. For Temujin, who had known the sting of abandonment, the promise of such loyalty must have seemed like a shield against the chaos of the plains. Yet the steppe had its own way of testing promises. At first, the bond between Temujin and Jamuka held strong. They hunted together, rode together, and dreamed together of uniting the fractured clans beneath one banner. Their ambitions aligned, their loyalty firm. But ambition is a hungry beast, and the steppe had room for only one who could command it fully. What began as friendship soon became rivalry, and what had been sworn in blood would one day be shattered in blood as well. Temujin's vision of leadership was different from the traditions of the steppe. Most chieftains ruled through kinship ties, giving preference to relatives and rewarding loyalty through bloodlines. Temujin saw the flaw in this. Blood could betray, as he had already learned. Instead, he offered power to those who proved themselves, whether born noble or common. A shepherd who fought bravely could rise higher than a prince who hesitated. Merit, not lineage, became the cornerstone of his authority. This philosophy drew many to him. Discontented warriors, men weary of being overlooked by arrogant nobles, found in Temujin a leader who valued their strength rather than their ancestry. But it also drew suspicion and envy. Jamuka, raised in the traditions of noble birth, clung to the old ways. Where Temujin sought to break the order of the clans, Jamuka sought to preserve it. Their friendship, once sealed with ritual, now strained beneath the weight of conflicting visions. The breaking of their bond was not sudden, but inevitable. At first, it showed in small ways. Decisions questioned, followers divided, ambitions clashing beneath the surface. Then it burst open in open conflict. Jamuka, claiming the title of Khan by noble blood, gathered a larger force, boasting tens of thousands of horsemen. Temujin, with fewer men, relied on discipline, on the merit of his warriors, and on the fierce loyalty he inspired through his relentless will. The clash between them was not merely a battle of swords, but of ideologies. Jamuka's camp represented the old steppe order, bound by aristocracy and tradition. Temujin's represented something new, a meritocracy forged by hardship and loyalty. The blood spilled on the grass that day was not just the ending of a friendship, it was the beginning of a transformation that would shape the entire steppe. Jamuka's forces at first overwhelmed Temujin's. In one infamous act of brutality, Jamuka captured 70 young men who had stood with his former Anda and executed them by boiling them alive. The cruelty of the punishment sent shockwaves across the steppe. It revealed Jamuka's ruthlessness, but it also exposed the fragility of his leadership. Fear could terrify men into obedience, but it could not inspire loyalty the way Temujin's merit-based vision could. Despite his losses, Temujin did not break. He withdrew, rebuilt, and drew more followers to him. The executions, meant to weaken him, instead drove others into his arms. Warriors who had once hesitated now saw in Temujin not just a leader, but a man who carried a vision stronger than blood ties and noble birth. The betrayal of Jamuka had cost him dearly, but it also revealed the power of the path Temujin had chosen. The Anda oath, meant to be unbreakable, lay in ashes. Its failure became a scar on Temujin's memory, but also another lesson carved deep into him. Trust was dangerous. Even bonds sealed in blood could be broken by ambition. From this point forward, his relationships with others would carry a harder edge. He would reward loyalty, yes, but he would never again place his fate entirely in the hands of another. The steppe had taught him too well. The story of Temujin and Jamuka spread across the plains, retold in whispers at campfires, remembered by those who had witnessed the slaughter. It was a story of friendship turned to rivalry, of oaths shattered, of visions colliding, and through it, the young leader, who had once been abandoned to the wolves, learned how to shape his own pack. His friendships would now be bound not by ritual alone, but by iron discipline, by fear of betrayal, and by the unshakable will that had carried him through starvation and exile. Blood oaths and broken friendships marked the turning point in his rise. From here, Temujin's path would no longer be guided by bonds of sentiment, but by the cold, ruthless logic of power. Those who followed him would be rewarded beyond imagination. Those who opposed him would be erased as if they had never existed. The grasslands that had once seemed endless and silent were beginning to echo with the sound of his ambition. And though the betrayal of his blood brother carved deep into his spirit, it also gave birth to the kind of leader the steppe had never seen before, a man who trusted no one fully, yet commanded the loyalty of thousands. A man who could endure the breaking of oaths and turn the ashes into fuel for conquest. The wind across the steppe carried more than dust and the scent of horses. It carried symbols. Among the nomads, every clan bore its banner, its totem, a marker of identity and power. Some bore falcons, others eagles. Some carried standards crowned with fire or silk streamers. But the most feared of them all was the banner of the wolf. For the Mongols, the wolf was more than an animal. It was a creature of survival, cunning, and hunger. In the old tales, the people themselves were said to descend from a blue-grey wolf and a doe. The wolf was the ancestor and protector, the prowler of night and guardian of the clan. To march beneath its likeness was not just to declare oneself a warrior, but to claim the very spirit of the steppe as one's ally. Temujin had known hunger. He had known betrayal. He had known what it was to be cast aside like carrion. Yet in his endurance, he mirrored the wolf itself, stalking, patient, never breaking even when wounded. As he gathered followers once more, the time came for him to adopt a symbol strong enough to bind them together. And so, the wolf banner was raised. It was not a grand standard of silk and gold like those carried by distant empires. It was raw, primal, made from horsehair dyed black, its strands whipping in the wind like claws stretched toward the sky. At its head stood a circle of iron from which 9 tails streamed, a totem of command that spoke directly to the soul of the steppe. To ride behind such a banner was to declare that one belonged to the pack, that loyalty to the leader was loyalty to the wolf itself. Men flocked to it. They were not the richest or the most noble. They were the dispossessed, the ambitious, the hardened, herdsmen who had lost families, warriors cast out by fickle khans, men who craved more than their lot. The wolf banner gave them a centre, a promise that they were no longer alone in the vast emptiness. Temujin gave them more than just a cause. He gave them discipline, order, something almost alien to the chaotic swirl of steppe warfare. Traditionally, battles between clans were little more than raids, fast, chaotic affairs where each man fought for plunder and glory. Temujin broke this pattern. He divided his followers into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, regardless of bloodline. Each man knew his place, his commander, his duty. Discipline became the true strength of his army. No longer would battles dissolve into disorder. Under the wolf banner, the Mongols learned to move as a single body, to strike like a pack circling prey. The effect was profound. Rivals who dismissed Temujin as a mere upstart began to fear him. His smaller, disciplined force could overwhelm much larger armies that relied on the old chaotic traditions. His warriors trained to feign retreat, luring enemies into ambushes. They moved with terrifying speed, striking before foes could even gather. And always, above them, the wolf banner streamed against the sky, a reminder that they fought not as scattered men, but as a single, relentless force. The symbolism spread beyond the battlefield. To swear loyalty to Temujin now meant swearing to the wolf banner itself, to the promise of unity and conquest. For men who had grown weary of clan rivalries and endless betrayals, it became something larger than themselves. The wolf banner was no longer just Temujin's. It was theirs, the embodiment of their hunger, their resilience, their destiny. Stories began to ripple across the grasslands of this rising power. Mothers warned their children that the wolf riders would come for those who strayed too far. Elders whispered that the steppe spirits had chosen a new master. Rivals dismissed him at their peril, but soon even they could not ignore the black horsehair streaming like night against the horizon. What set Temujin apart was not only the symbol he carried, but how he used it to shape the world around him. He did not merely demand loyalty, he rewarded it with unimaginable generosity. A warrior who proved himself might receive a share of plunder greater than his birth could ever have promised. Captured enemies who pledged themselves sincerely might find themselves integrated rather than destroyed. But betrayal, once proven, was met with unflinching brutality. The wolf banner thus became a promise of two extremes: protection for the loyal, annihilation for the faithless. Under it, Temujin forged something the steppe had never known: a vision of unity that extended beyond tribe, beyond kinship, beyond the fragile oaths that had so often collapsed. As the seasons turned, the reputation of his banner spread far. Scouts and traders whispered of its rise. Rivals watched uneasily as the packs beneath it grew stronger. their discipline sharper, their raids more devastating. What had begun as a ragged following was transforming into an army that would one day make the world tremble. The wolf itself was a creature of both fear and reverence on the steppe. And now that duality clung to Temujin. To his enemies, he became the prowler in the night, a hunter who would not stop until his prey was torn down. To his followers, he was the alpha, the protector, the one who gave meaning to their struggles. The wolf banner was more than a standard. It was the soul of the empire yet to come. And so, when the horsehair tails whipped in the wind, when the iron circle gleamed in the sun, it was not only Temujin's command that the world saw rising. It was the declaration that the steppe itself had awakened, that its hunger would no longer be confined to its endless grasslands. The wolf had risen, and with it, a force that would devour kingdoms, cities, and millions of lives. On the boundless grasslands, every victory seemed to call forth betrayal. The moment a man rose above his peers, rivals sharpened their blades in silence. Power on the steppe was never secure. It was a fragile thing, as easily stolen as a horse in the night. Temujin understood this more than most. His life had begun with treachery, the desertion of his clan, the theft of his inheritance, the breaking of an oath by Jamuka. Betrayal was the crucible in which he had been hammered, and now revenge was the steel edge that kept him moving forward. As the wolf banner gained strength, the old aristocratic clans grew restless. They watched with unease as Temujin ignored tradition, raising common men to high positions, stripping the nobility of their sacred privilege. For some, it was an insult too great to bear. Among them was the Taichi Ud, one of the powerful tribes who had once cast Temujin's family into exile. Their hatred smouldered, and when the opportunity came, they struck with cunning precision. Temujin was captured, bound in a wooden collar so heavy it cut into his shoulders and chafed his skin raw. For a boy who had once clawed his way from starvation, it was a humiliation that should have broken him. Yet even in chains, his spirit remained unyielding. Guards mocked him, villagers jeered, but within, the memory of abandonment kept his will sharp. He bided his time, studying every face, every guard shift, waiting for the sliver of weakness that might open his cage. One night, under the thin light of the moon, that weakness arrived. A sympathetic herdsman, perhaps seeing in the young captive a reflection of his own longing for freedom, loosened his bindings. Temujin fled into the dark, dragging the wooden collar through mud and grass, stumbling toward the horizon until it finally splintered away. Betrayal had led him into chains, but cunning and patience had delivered him back to the steppe. Such scars never faded. The weight of that collar lingered in his memory, fueling a hunger not just for survival, but for vengeance. When he returned, it was not as a fugitive, but as a leader hardened by captivity. The Taichi Ud, who had humiliated him, became a target marked for punishment. Temujin's followers rallied with renewed fervour, for they too carried their own wounds of betrayal, abandoned loyalties, stolen herds, dishonoured kin. The promise of revenge bound them as tightly as discipline. Revenge on the steppe was rarely swift. It came like winter storms, inevitable and merciless. Temujin struck with calculated precision, turning on his betrayers with the discipline that set his forces apart. Villages burned, herds were seized, captives taken. For every insult endured in his youth, he carved retribution into the land. But unlike other Khans, his vengeance was never blind. He spared those who submitted, absorbed them into his ranks, and punished only those who defied him. Revenge was not just an outlet, it was a tool, a way to build power even from the ashes of his enemies. The betrayal of Jamukha too lingered like an open wound. Once blood brothers, they had become mortal rivals, and Jamukha's cruelty, the boiling alive of Temujin's captured warriors, demanded repayment. Temujin never forgot. He carried that memory like a brand across his mind. Every alliance he forged afterward was shaped by it. No oath could be trusted. No friendship assumed permanent. Only discipline, fear, and reward could secure men's loyalty. The old Anda bond had been shattered. In its place rose the iron rule of the wolf banner. And so, step by step, Temujin reshaped betrayal into strength. Every treachery became a lesson. Every defeat, a rehearsal for greater conquest. His followers learned alongside him, watching how he turned setbacks into fuel. They saw how he punished traitors without hesitation, but also how he forgave those who bent the knee and proved themselves anew. To serve him was to live under constant vigilance, but also under the certainty of justice, harsh, unwavering, predictable. On a step where betrayal was as common as breathing, that certainty was a revelation. The whispers of his vengeance spread far. Stories of the wooden collar, of his escape, of the Taichi Ud's ruin, passed from mouth to mouth. Enemies came to fear him not only for his cunning in battle, but for his unyielding memory. Temujin did not forget slights. He did not forgive cruelty. Those who wronged him might survive for a time, but eventually the wolf pack would circle back, and the price would be exacted. Yet it was not vengeance alone that defined him. Betrayal forged the edge of his will, but discipline tempered it. He was not consumed by rage, he wielded it. Each act of revenge served a greater design, the unification of the steppe under his rule. What had begun as personal grudges transformed into a campaign of consolidation. Clans that betrayed him once found themselves either annihilated or absorbed. Rivals who dared to test his patience discovered that revenge from Temujin was not a fleeting strike, but a storm that scoured the plains clean. In time, even betrayal itself became part of his weaponry. Temujin learned to turn enemies against each other, to exploit the fragile trust between rival clans, to sow discord that weakened them before his wolves descended. Betrayal, once a wound, had become a tool sharpened by experience. He no longer merely endured it, he mastered it. The steppe, always restless, now seemed to pulse with a new rhythm. The wolf banner did not only mark victories, it carried the weight of vengeance fulfilled, of betrayals avenged, of old wounds turned into strength. And behind it, Temujin grew into more than a man. He became a force shaped by cruelty, driven by memory, and defined by the relentless logic that only through fear, loyalty, and unyielding will could the chaos of the plains be mastered. The boy abandoned, the prisoner in chains, the betrayed friend. Each of these lives had died on the steppe. What remained was a leader, forged in betrayal and sharpened by revenge, a man who would stop at nothing until the world itself lay beneath the shadow of his banner. The steppe was a sea of splintered allegiances, a place where every clan carried its own banner. Every chieftain believed himself master, and every oath dissolved as quickly as the morning frost. For generations, no hand had been strong enough to close around this shifting world. Tribes raided and betrayed, scattered across the grasslands like seeds cast to the wind. To bend such chaos into a single fist required more than strength. It required a vision so unrelenting that it could not be ignored. Temujin carried that vision like a flame. His rise had already unsettled the balance. Defeated clans, whether by fire or persuasion, found themselves absorbed into his growing host. The wolf banner, which once belonged only to his closest companions, now cast its shadow over thousands. Yet victory alone was never enough. On the steppe, numbers mattered less than unity, and unity was the one thing his world despised. Every tribe carried grudges older than memory, and blood feuds stretched across generations. To weld them together demanded something stronger than fear. It required a new order. Temujin began with the foundation of loyalty. Birth no longer guaranteed power. Aristocratic titles that had once shielded men from consequence were stripped away. Instead, positions were granted by merit, by loyalty proven, by skill displayed, by discipline maintained. The son of a blacksmith could ride beside the son of a noble if both had proven themselves worthy. For the old clans, this was sacrilege, but for the restless and the ambitious, it was a revolution. They flocked to him, men who had once been overlooked, now offered a place at the table of power. The clans that resisted this order soon learned its cost. Temujin's campaigns grew more relentless. He struck not only with cavalry, but with precision. Villages that surrendered were spared, folded into his ranks with promises of safety and spoils. Villages that resisted were reduced to ash, their survivors scattered as slaves. It was a rhythm the steppe had never known before. War guided not by rage or impulse, but by calculation. Mercy and terror became twin blades in his hand, cutting away resistance and binding the survivors to him with cords of necessity. Discipline marked his army apart from all others. The Mongols had always been horsemen of extraordinary skill, but under Temujin, they became something else entirely. Orders were obeyed instantly, supplies carefully rationed, punishments carried out without hesitation. Theft, once a common way of life, was outlawed among his followers. No man could take plunder before the battle was over. No warrior could abandon his unit without facing death. On the steppe, where clans had lived in endless rivalry and chaos, such discipline felt unnatural, almost inhuman. Yet it gave his host a strength no rival could match. Bit by bit, the scattered tribes began to fold under his shadow. Some came willingly, drawn by the promise of order and wealth. Others bent after bitter defeats, choosing submission over annihilation. Temujin understood that uniting the steppe required not only fear, but the weaving of a new identity. To the clans who joined him, he gave more than commands. He gave belonging. They were no longer fractured peoples, but warriors of a greater whole. The wolf banner did not belong to one family or one tribe, it belonged to all who followed it. Still, old feuds did not vanish easily. Even within his growing camp, grudges smouldered. Men who once raided each other now shared fires, suspicious eyes watching across the flames. Temujin answered with iron discipline. He broke disputes swiftly, punishing both sides equally if they dared to reignite blood feuds. Gradually, the endless cycle of revenge that had torn the steppe apart began to fade. For the first time in memory, men who had once been enemies found themselves fighting side by side, not for their tribe alone, but for something larger. The transformation was slow, but unmistakable. Camps once divided by banners began to blend. Warriors wore the same insignia, obeyed the same code, and swore loyalty not just to their Khan, but to the idea that survival demanded unity. The scattered clans were becoming fingers of a single hand, flexible, strong, capable of striking together as one. Temujin himself became the embodiment of this new order. He was not simply another Khan. He was a living example of what discipline, vengeance, and vision could forge. Every scar he bore, every betrayal he endured, became part of his legend. To his followers, he was more than a man. He was proof that the steppe's chaos could be mastered, that the cycle of betrayal and bloodshed could be broken by one will. But uniting the steppe was not an act of peace. It was an act of war. Each conquest added to his strength, but it also provoked new enemies. As his influence spread, rival chieftains saw not a unifier, but a threat to the independence they prized above all else. Alliances formed against him, brittle but dangerous. Temujin met them not with hesitation, but with the same relentlessness that had carried him from exile to power. Battles thundered across the plains, dust clouds rising, arrows blackening the sky, cavalry wheeling and striking with precision. Again and again, the old ways faltered before his discipline. Rival hosts broke apart under the weight of their own disunity, while his forces struck as if guided by a single mind. Victory fed victory, and soon the very idea of resisting him seemed futile. By the time the dust settled, the dream that had seemed impossible for centuries had begun to take form. The clans of the steppe, once scattered, divided, and endlessly feuding, were closing into a single fist under Temujin's command. The wolf banner that had once fluttered above a handful of warriors now loomed over a nation in the making. Yet unification was not an end. It was only the sharpening of a blade. The fist that had clenched around the steppe would soon strike outward, toward worlds that had never imagined the fury of the Mongols. For now, though, the grasslands themselves lay silent under his rule, bound together for the first time in memory, no longer scattered fragments, but one hand, one banner, one will. The winds that swept across the Mongolian steppe carried more than the scent of grass and horse sweat now. They carried whispers of a name, Temujin, spoken with awe, with fear, with grudging respect. For years he had bent the chaos of scattered tribes into discipline, forged enemies into allies, and ground resistance into dust. Now the moment had come when the clans, long accustomed to defiance, could no longer deny that they had been bound into something greater than themselves. The steppe was no longer a patchwork of feuding banners. It was gathering under a single shadow, and that shadow demanded recognition. It happened on the sacred ground near the Onon River, a place where Khans had once been chosen in fleeting ceremonies that dissolved as quickly as they were sworn. This time, however, the air was heavier, charged with the weight of inevitability. Thousands assembled, men who had once raised blades against each other, now standing shoulder to shoulder. Women, children, and elders gathered on the edges, their faces turned toward the man who had remade their world. The ritual was simple, but its meaning immense. Warriors carried fermented mare's milk in great bowls, offering it as a symbol of unity. Elders recited words that echoed from ancient memory, binding the tribes together beneath a single Khan. The wolf banner snapped in the wind, its black tails fluttering like shadows over the crowd. And at the centre stood Temujin, no longer merely the leader of a clan, but the master of all who had survived the long storm of blood and betrayal. He was raised upon a felt carpet, lifted high by the arms of the chiefs, as tradition demanded. The gesture carried more than symbolism. It was an acknowledgement that his authority came not from heaven or from birthright alone, but from the hands of the men who carried him, the warriors who had fought and bled beneath his command. In that instant, Temujin ceased to be a name whispered across the grasslands. He became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, a title that declared not just leadership, but destiny. The moment was not one of quiet triumph. It was the tightening of a bowstring. The tribes had united before, only to collapse into chaos once their leader fell. Genghis Khan understood that his crown was not a prize, but a weapon. To keep it, he needed more than loyalty. He needed a system strong enough to outlive any single man. His first act was to cement the code that bound his people. The Yasa, as it came to be known, was a set of laws both brutal and precise. Theft was punished by death, no matter the thief's station. Adultery, long a source of endless blood feuds, was outlawed, and offenders met the executioner's blade. Spies, traitors, and oath-breakers were hunted without mercy. But the laws did not only restrain, they protected. Religious tolerance was decreed, granting shamans, Buddhists, Muslims, and Nestorian Christians alike the right to practice without fear. The weak were shielded by rules against the exploitation of widows and orphans. In a land where chaos had been the only law, the yasa was an iron spine, binding the steppe into something resembling permanence. From this moment of crowning, his vision expanded outward. The steppe alone could not satisfy the hunger that had been born in chains, nurtured in exile, and sharpened by years of war. The grasslands were now a fist, but a fist demanded an enemy to strike. The great cities beyond the steppe, caravan hubs heavy with silk and silver, kingdoms that had long dismissed the nomads as barbarians, now stood within his gaze. The crowning was not an end, but the prelude to a storm that would roll far beyond the horizon. Those gathered at the Kurultai, the Great Council, understood the gravity of what they had created. By proclaiming him Genghis Khan, they had transformed themselves as well. They were no longer leaders of squabbling tribes, but generals in the making, commanders of an empire that did not yet exist, but already pressed against the edges of imagination. The title had drawn a line in the dust. Before it lay centuries of division, after it stretched the possibility of conquest without end, Genghis Khan did not smile on that day. His face, weathered by wind and scarred by battle, carried no expression of triumph. He spoke of duty, of the weight that bound him to the people, of the vengeance still owed to those who had once humiliated the Mongols. His words were not poetry, but commands, clear and unshakable. He demanded loyalty, not applause. The steppe had not crowned him to bask in glory, but to lead them into a world that would soon drown in fire. The wolf banner above him cracked like a whip in the wind. Below it, men swore oaths not to their clans, but to him. For the first time, the Mongols belonged to more than their kin. They belonged to a nation. And from that nation would rise a tide that would sweep across deserts, mountains, and rivers, leaving only silence where ancient cities once stood. The crowning on the Onon was remembered not for ceremony, but for transformation. It was the moment the scattered voices of the steppe blended into one, the moment when survival was no longer enough, when ambition took on the shape of destiny. Genghis Khan was not merely raised upon a carpet that day. He was lifted into legend, into a place where the fate of millions would bend beneath his will. And as the sun set over the endless grasslands, its light glinting off the blades of warriors gathered in their thousands, the silence that followed was not peace. It was the hush that comes before thunder, before hooves shake the earth, before arrows blot out the sky Yazar. The steppe had crowned its ruler, and the world beyond its borders had no idea that its days were already numbered. The crowning of Genghis Khan had not been the closing of a tale, but the cracking open of something vast and dangerous. The grasslands lay behind him, bound at last into unity, and before him stretched the limitless horizon. His people were no longer scattered clans clinging to survival. They were a nation on horseback, forged in hunger and betrayal, disciplined by iron laws, and sharpened into the most fearsome cavalry the world had yet seen. When the storm broke, it did not crawl forward like the armies of settled kingdoms. It swept, sudden and merciless, across the earth. The Mongols were riders from birth, taught to grip the mane of a horse before they could walk. Their bows, small enough to be drawn in the saddle, carried arrows with killing force that could pierce armour from 100 paces. Each warrior travelled with multiple mounts, changing horses to keep the pace unbroken, allowing them to cover distances that seemed impossible to those who trudged on foot. Against them, traditional armies moved like lumbering beasts, slow, disjointed, predictable. The storm riders were not simply warriors. They were shadows in motion, scouts gliding miles ahead, reading the land as though it were a living text. Rivers, mountain passes, desert trails, nothing escaped their notice. Herds were driven with the army, families carried in wagons, entire camps uprooted and set into motion. What seemed like chaos was in fact a design, a nation that could move as swiftly as a hunting pack, striking before news of its approach could even reach its prey. When they attacked with silence at first, blackening the sky with arrows before a single sword was drawn. Villages collapsed under the sudden rain of death. Those who tried to flee found themselves cut off, surrounded by riders who moved as though they had poured from the very horizon itself. And when the signal came, the horsemen swept forward in waves, blades flashing, trampling anything that stood. It was not battle as the settled world understood it. It was the arrival of a storm that no wall, no army could hold back. Genghis Khan himself rode at the heart of it, not in gilded armour or draped in silks, but as a warrior indistinguishable from those around him. He ate what they ate, endured what they endured, and enforced the same law upon himself that bound the rest. Yet his mind was always ahead of the battlefield, turning vengeance into calculation. Every attack was chosen not only for conquest, but for terror. Cities were spared when they submitted, burned when they resisted. Word spread faster than his armies, and fear rode with him like a herald, arriving before the first arrow was loosed. The storm riders were taught to fight as units, not individuals. Each group of 10 answered to a single leader, who in turn answered to the leader of 100, then 1,000, then 10,000. It was a lattice of control, so precise that orders could flow across the battlefield as if through veins, and the entire host would shift as a single body. Where rival armies broke into chaos under pressure, the Mongols bent like grass in the wind, then snapped back with lethal precision. This discipline, more than numbers or savagery, made them unstoppable. Their enemies at first dismissed them as raiders, another band of horsemen like countless others before. But they were not raiders. They were not content with plunder or fleeting triumph. They sought submission, permanence, and the erasure of defiance. Villages that resisted were left in silence, their inhabitants slaughtered, their ashes scattered to the wind. Those who submitted were woven into the fabric of the Mongol host, given places within the army, their talents repurposed for the greater cause. Craftsmen, scribes, physicians, all were carried along, absorbed into the moving storm. And so, the empire began to spread outward, not like the slow crawl of stone walls and borders, but like fire across dry grass. From the northern forests to the deserts of Central Asia, the horsemen arrived, swift as wind, merciless as thunder. Every conquest fed the next. The herds of captured lands swelled their numbers. The resources of defeated cities fueled their campaigns. Where once the Mongols had struggled for survival, they now carried abundance with them. And that abundance was turned into sharper blades, stronger bows, and endless campaigns. Yet even in the height of slaughter, Genghis Khan never allowed chaos to consume his riders. Punishment was harsh and swift for those who defied orders. Loot was divided according to strict rules, ensuring that every man received his share. No single warrior could claim glory alone. It belonged to the host, to the unity that made them more than tribes. This balance between terror and order, between destruction and discipline, was the true power of the Storm Riders. They were not a horde of savages. They were an instrument, sharpened by law and wielded by a hand that never trembled. The earth itself seemed to tremble under their hooves. In towns and cities beyond the steppe, whispers grew into panic. Merchants spoke of caravans vanishing without a trace, of entire villages gone silent, of horizons darkened by cavalry. Rulers scoffed, certain their walls would hold. But the storm riders were not turned aside by walls. They learned to surround, to cut off supplies, to starve cities until their gates opened. Those who resisted to the end found their streets drenched in blood, their names struck from the map of the living. The crowning of Genghis Khan had given the Mongols unity. The storm that followed gave them destiny. No kingdom lay too far, no city too strong, no people too proud to escape their reach. They moved with the certainty of thunder rolling across the sky, inevitable, inescapable, consuming everything in its path. And yet, this was only the beginning. For the storm riders of the steppe were not content to rule the grasslands or the neighbouring valleys. Their gaze stretched farther, toward empires whose wealth dwarfed anything the Mongols had yet seen. The desert caravans, the glittering cities of Islam, the fortresses of China, these were not distant dreams, but targets marked by the mind of a man who had risen from abandonment and chains to command the greatest cavalry the world had ever known. The storm had broken. The world was about to learn what it meant to live beneath its shadow. The riders poured outward like a black tide, and wherever they moved, cities felt their breath before they saw their faces. The Mongols had no need for the permanence of stone walls or towering gates. Their world was endless grass, shifting horizons, a land without boundaries. But when they confronted the places where men stacked stone upon stone, where rulers believed walls would protect them from the wind, they learned not to ride around them, but through them. The first great cities to face them had not imagined such an enemy. Their markets buzzed with merchants. Their mosques rang with prayer. Their streets clattered with the rhythm of trade. They thought themselves secure. After all, hadn't walls always held back raiders from the steppe? But what came against them was not a raid. It was a storm given purpose. The Mongols studied walls the way hunters study the burrows of their prey, circling, probing, cutting off every path of escape. No caravan left. No messenger arrived. Slowly, the life inside the city began to starve. Siege was not new in the world, but the Mongols practiced it with a cold thoroughness that felt new. They built engines of war with the help of captured engineers, men dragged along from one conquest to the next. Catapults that hurled stones and fire, towers that crept toward walls, rams that battered gates. Tools stolen from one city and turned against the next. To the Mongols, every conquest was not only a victory, but a lesson. Every fortified place they cracked open taught them how to make the next fall faster. The terror, however, was never just in the machines or the arrows. It was in the choice the cities were given. Submit and live. Resist and vanish. Many rulers gambled on defiance, trusting to stone and faith, and paid with the silence of their people. Entire populations were dragged into the streets, cut down with such efficiency that the survivors could only stumble through empty alleys filled with corpses. Ash was piled where palaces had stood. Smoke curled into the heavens as though marking another name erased from the map of the living. One city in the Khwarezmian lands, swollen with wealth from the Silk Road, once held tens of thousands within its walls. It believed itself untouchable, its ruler defiant. But when the Mongols came, they sealed the gates from without and from within. No water, no food, no way to breathe. The city's strength collapsed inward, and when the horsemen finally entered, there was no army left to fight, only hollow faces and desperate hands clawing for mercy. Mercy was denied. The streets became rivers of blood, and when the riders left, they left nothing but scorched earth behind them. For every city that vanished, another was spared, if it bent the knee in time. This was not mercy in the way the world understood it, but strategy. A surrendered city became a node in the Mongol machine. Its craftsmen folded into the host. Its scribes set to work in new records. Its soldiers dispersed to other fronts. A pattern of survival emerged. Yield, and you would live in service. Resist, and your city would exist only in memory, its smoke rising into the endless steppe winds. Word of these vanishings travelled faster than the riders themselves. Merchants whispered of towns that had been alive 1 week and ash the next. Refugees stumbled into neighbouring lands with nothing but horror in their voices. The fear spread like wildfire, and often it was this fear that opened gates before the horsemen even appeared. Walls were no longer shields. They had become tombstones, waiting for their epitaphs. What made the vanishings even more unbearable was the swiftness. Cities that had taken generations to build, that had been carved out of deserts or raised from riverbanks with untold toil, were undone in days. Markets silenced, temples flattened, neighbourhoods swallowed in flame. It was not only the bodies that were destroyed, but the memory, the continuity of a place. To watch the Mongols arrive was to know that everything your ancestors had built could be unmade before the sun set twice. The steppe warriors themselves carried no sentiment for the walls they toppled. To them, these cities were symbols of resistance, challenges to be broken. Once broken, they were discarded like husks, stripped of what was useful and left to rot. The empire they were building did not rest on stone foundations, but on obedience, mobility and the vanishings served a double purpose. They erased defiance and announced to the next city what awaited if the same choice was made. The smoke that followed them became a language. Villages on distant hills looked to the horizon and saw dark plumes spiralling into the sky, and they knew what it meant without a word spoken. Each pillar of ash was a warning, a marker of erasure. And as the riders pressed farther west and south, the smoke trails followed, dotting the landscape like grim beacons. And yet, even in their destruction, the Mongols carried the world's knowledge forward with them. Cities that vanished in smoke also provided them with artisans who could craft bridges, siege engines, and weapons. Scholars who could translate maps or record decrees were spared, often gathered and driven with the army, unwilling servants of an empire that thrived on both slaughter and skill. The vanishings, then, were never mindless rage. They were deliberate, an act of terror woven with practicality. Those who witnessed it and lived to tell the tale struggled to describe the silence afterward. The silence was worse than the screaming, worse than the flames. It was the emptiness of streets where no footsteps remained, the hollowness of wells that no one drew from, the absence of voices where markets had once thrived. Smoke lingered long after the riders had gone, curling into the sky, as if the city itself exhaled its last breath. The Mongol Empire expanded on the back of these disappearances, each conquest erasing another centre of resistance. What had once been thriving cities became stories told in hushed tones, names passed down only as examples of what defiance earned. They were not merely destroyed, they were deleted from the fabric of the earth. Reminders that in the age of Genghis Khan, survival was not a matter of strength or walls, but of submission. By the time the Storm Riders turned their gaze toward greater empires, the world already lay half blind with smoke. The vanishings had done their work. The terror was alive, and the horizon was darkening again. The earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of what the Mongols demanded from it. Cities could burn, rivers could choke with bodies, and yet there was always one more demonstration left behind. A monument more terrible than flame, more lasting than smoke. When stone walls collapsed and palaces crumbled, the Mongols raised their own monuments from the flesh and bone of their victims. Fields sprouted not with crops, but with skulls stacked into pyramids. These ghastly towers rose where proud gates once stood. their white curves gleaming in the sun like trophies to the storm that had passed. The harvest began not with choice, but with punishment. A city that resisted too long, or a ruler who mocked Genghis Khan's demands, ensured that its fate would not end merely in fire. Soldiers went street by street, dragging men, women, and children into the open. They were not searching for fighters. They were searching for symbols. The pile must be high enough to be seen from afar, high enough that the survivors in distant lands would hear about it and tremble. Every skull was a message, and the Mongols were fluent in this language of dread. In Nishapur, after a rebellion flared in the ashes of conquest, the Mongols answered with a massacre so absolute that the land itself seemed poisoned by it. The city was emptied, its people reduced to heaps of bone. Chroniclers whispered that the skulls of men, women, and children were sorted into separate pyramids, as if even in death the Mongols wished to catalogue their warning. Whether the numbers recorded, hundreds of thousands some said, were exaggerated mattered little. The memory of white heaps under the sun spread like wildfire, carried by refugees who staggered away with eyes still haunted by the sight. It was not only vengeance that fueled these grim monuments. Fear was the engine. Genghis Khan understood that terror could ride faster than any horse, travel farther than any arrow. A single city reduced to skulls could open the gates of 10 others without a fight. Each harvest saved the Mongols time, spared them arrows, preserved their strength for greater prey. The message was mercilessly clear. Resist, and your bones will join the pile. Submit, and you will live to serve. The men who carried out this work were not blinded by bloodlust. To them, it was duty, as systematic as feeding their horses or oiling their bows. Some gathered skulls with quiet efficiency, tossing them into heaps with the same detachment as stacking firewood. Others halved the piles into neat mounds, arranging them with geometric precision, as though this was art in its most brutal form. When they rode away, they left behind not chaos, but order, an order written in bone. The silence that followed these harvests was worse than the slaughter itself. Travellers who passed through the ruins spoke of winds whistling through hollow sockets, of crows picking at the edges of pyramids until feathers blackened the air. Nights grew restless in such places. Even hardened soldiers felt unease camping near them, as though the skulls still watched, as though the dead refused to be silent witnesses to their own erasure. And yet, these pyramids became landmarks of empire. They dotted the Silk Road, grim signposts pointing the way toward submission. Merchants who once traded silk and spices now traded stories of what they had seen. Towns where the only thing left standing was a mound of bleached skulls. For those who listened, it was not merely a tale of cruelty, but a map of the Mongols' relentless advance. Every monument of bone marked a territory folded into the empire's shadow. There were those who tried to erase the memory, who buried the heaps under earth, or scattered the bones across fields. But the memory clung harder than stone. In time, entire generations grew up with the whispers of these harvests. Parents warned their children that defiance was not bravery, but folly, pointing to the horizon where pyramids of bone were said to gleam beneath the sun. In that way, the harvest lived longer than the walls they toppled, longer than the cities they destroyed. The Mongols themselves were not haunted by these acts. To them, it was survival. The steppe had no place for mercy when it meant weakness. Their lives had been carved from scarcity, where every failure meant starvation. What they did to cities was not cruelty in their eyes, but necessity on a grand scale. A warning written once, so it would not need to be written 100 times more. For them, the harvest of skulls was not only vengeance, it was efficiency. Still, even the efficiency could not conceal the weight of the numbers. Chroniclers across Asia and the Middle East recorded cities emptied of life, populations measured in the tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, erased in a matter of days. By the time the Mongols had swept across Khwarezm, Persia and beyond, the estimated dead rose into tens of millions. The pyramids of skulls were only the visible tip of an ocean of absence. Beneath every field, bones remained hidden, mingled with the soil, feeding the grass that swayed in the steppe winds. To the living, it was impossible to ignore. Imagine approaching your city's gates and finding no guards, no merchants, no cries from the marketplace, only a pyramid of skulls where your people once stood. Imagine walking down your street and realizing that every voice you once knew had been extinguished, leaving only the hollow sockets staring back at you. That was the landscape left behind in the Mongol wake, an empire not just of territory, but of silence. And as they moved onward, the memory of these harvests travelled with them, woven into their legend. Each skull was more than bone. It was a story, a reminder, a warning. It was the language of empire, spoken without words, understood without translation. And long after the pyramids crumbled and the wind scattered the bones, the memory remained, heavy and unyielding, as if the earth itself still carried the echo of all that had been erased. The Mongols conquered not only with fire and bone, but with the very elements that gave life. Rivers, once lifelines of cities and empires, became part of their theatre of destruction. These waters had carried merchants, fed fields, and sustained civilizations for centuries. But in the shadow of the horsemen, they turned into conduits of death. Blood poured into streams, corpses drifted downstream, and the currents carried with them the silence of whole populations. The slaughter was not confined to walls or gates. It spilled into the natural veins of the land. Along the Oxus and Sir Daria, where irrigation canals had once made deserts bloom, the Mongols unmade what men had so carefully built. Canals were choked with bodies, the water running dark with the weight of the fallen. Farmers who had relied on these channels to grow wheat and barley watched their lifelines foul with blood and rot. Rivers that had given life for generations became poison, their waters undrinkable, their flow slowed by the sheer mass of the dead. Chroniclers told of cities whose populations were marched to the banks, executed in great waves, and cast into the current. The water carried them away in grim procession, limbs tangling with reeds, faces staring upward at the indifferent sky. For those downstream, the sight announced what was coming before the horsemen even arrived. To look into the river was to see the future, and that future was ruin. In Merv, one of the richest cities of Persia, the destruction was so complete that rivers around it turned into floating cemeteries. Survivors spoke of days when the stench rose thick in the air, carried by the wind for miles. Flocks of vultures and crows descended, not just on the battlefields, but on the water itself, wings blackening the horizon as they feasted on corpses borne by the current. To drink from these rivers was to drink death itself. It was not only the bodies that fouled the waters. The Mongols, in their fury against defiance, often diverted rivers to drown fields, collapse fortifications, or erase entire towns. Irrigation systems were destroyed, dams broken, canals filled with rubble and corpses alike. A land that had once pulsed with agriculture shriveled, its fertility erased in a single campaign. The destruction of water was more devastating than the sword. It was annihilation that outlasted the riders. The horror lay not only in the act, but in its scale. Numbers scrawled in the record speak of hundreds of thousands perishing in single cities. Each life lost meant another body consigned to the soil, to the flames, or to the water. And when water took them, it carried their absence across miles, stitching death into every river bend. Entire regions starved, not only because the people were gone, but because the land could no longer drink. Travellers who passed through these landscapes in the years after conquest described the aftermath in tones that bordered on disbelief. One Persian writer spoke of the rivers running thick as soup with the remains of the slain, the surface broken by skulls like pale lilies in a crimson pond. Fishermen pulled in nets heavy, not with carp, but with the remnants of men. The sound of the rivers had changed. Instead of murmuring life, they gurgled as if choking on what had been forced into them. To the Mongols, this was not cruelty without purpose. It was the same logic that built pyramids of skulls. To poison water was to extinguish resistance without lifting a bow. When rivers became death itself, cities could not rise again. Those who might rebuild were too few, too fearful, or too sickened by the land itself to continue. Every defiled river was another frontier pacified, another pocket of resistance drowned before it could begin. The memory of these rivers travelled farther than their currents. Refugees spoke of streams that ran red for days, of mothers dragging children away from banks where bodies drifted by. The terror spread faster than the horsemen, making towns surrender rather than risk the same fate. The rivers themselves became Mongol heralds, whispering of slaughter long before hoofbeats thundered on the horizon. Even nature seemed unsettled by what had been forced upon it. Crops failed in fields that once drank from poisoned channels. Wells collapsed, fouled by decay. Villages starved not from the swords, but from the absence of water they could trust. What the Mongols left behind was more than emptiness. It was corruption, a lingering reminder that even the elements could be turned into weapons when harnessed by ruthless will. Yet for all their pragmatism, the Mongols could not control how the rivers carried memory. Generations later, stories were still told of waterways turned crimson, of fish that tasted of rot, of birds flocking in unholy numbers above the currents. The rivers had once been veins of civilization. Now they were scars carved deep into the land's memory. To stand by those waters in the aftermath was to feel the weight of all that had been lost. The currents whispered with ghosts, carrying them endlessly downstream, as though the land itself refused to let them rest. No chronicle could fully capture the sight of a river running red beneath the sun, nor the silence of survivors staring into it, knowing their world had been carried away. The Mongol conquest was measured not only in cities destroyed, not only in skulls harvested, but in rivers defiled. They had been transformed from lifelines into monuments of a different kind, monuments that moved, that spread, that carried memory as relentlessly as the Empire's horsemen. And in their depths, they carried the truth, that an empire could wipe away 40 million lives, not just with arrows and fire, but by turning life's most vital force into a stream of death. Cities were meant to be sanctuaries. Behind walls of stone, people believed themselves safe from the chaos of the steppe. Towers rose high, gates were reinforced with iron, and moats filled with water stood between civilization and the wilderness. For centuries, those walls had held, against raiders, against rival kingdoms, against every threat men could imagine, but nothing in stone or mortar was prepared for the storm that came with the Mongols. When the horsemen arrived before a city, they brought with them not only the speed of their cavalry, but the patience of engineers. Sieges were no longer the slow contest of attrition that the medieval world had known. Under Mongol command, they became instruments of shock and terror, dismantling centuries of faith in fortress walls. Take the fall of Zhongdu, the great city of the Jin dynasty, where the Mongols demonstrated that they were more than riders. They were strategists of annihilation. The siege began with thunder that came not from the sky, but from engines of war dragged across the plains. Catapults, mangonels, and siege towers rolled forward, designed with knowledge borrowed and stolen from across Eurasia. Engineers from conquered lands, whether Chinese, Persian or Arab, had been folded into the Mongol war machine, their expertise turned against their own kin. Stones the size of boulders hurtled into the city, smashing rooftops, crumbling walls, and setting fires that spread faster than citizens could put them out. Night was no refuge. Firepots lit the skyline in ghastly orange, while drums thundered to break sleep and sap morale. Every sound carried the same message. There was no sanctuary here, no escape from the storm waiting beyond the walls. And when patience ran out, the Mongols unleashed ingenuity that defied imagination. Accounts speak of great siege towers covered in hides to resist flaming arrows, rolling forward like monstrous beasts. From their platforms, archers rained down death, their arrows blotting out the sky. Beneath them, miners dug tunnels to undermine the city's foundations, collapsing towers and leaving breaches wide enough for cavalry to pour through. The defenders watched as their walls, once symbols of permanence, turned brittle against the endless assault. Yet even as walls crumbled, the true horror was what followed. For the Mongols, breaching a city was only the beginning. The storm that entered those gates did not distinguish soldier from child, governor from beggar. The streets ran with blood as surely as rivers had before, and the massacre was carried out with a discipline that felt less like rage and more like ritual. Resistance was not punished, it was erased. The siege of Nishapur in Persia carried this truth to its extreme. After the city fell, and a Mongol commander was killed in the fighting, the retribution was not measured in dozens or hundreds, but in every living soul. Chroniclers tell of streets piled with bodies, of executions so methodical that whole quarters were silenced in a single day. By the end, the city was no longer a place, but a grave. The pattern repeated across continents. Samarkand, once a jewel of Central Asia, believed its walls could withstand the horsemen. Its leaders paraded elephants in defence, banners flying, confidence swelling. But the Mongols had patience, engines, and fear itself on their side. In days, elephants lay dead in the streets, the walls breached, and Samarkand's splendour drowned in fire and ash. Each siege was more than conquest. It was theatre. Survivors who fled carried stories that travelled faster than the Mongols themselves. Stories of towers that fell as though made of sand, of catapults that hurled not only stone, but the heads of the slain, spreading terror before the gates even opened. Entire kingdoms quailed at the whispers. To resist meant destruction. To submit, survival, at least for a time. The Mongols used this reputation as deftly as any sword. Some cities, upon hearing of the sieges, opened their gates without a fight, hoping to avoid the fate of Nishapur or Zhongdu. Yet submission brought only brief reprieve. Tribute could buy time, but sooner or later, the storm returned. No wall was high enough, no moat wide enough, no fortress impregnable. The collapse of these cities did more than kill. It unstitched the very fabric of civilizations. Libraries burned, markets turned to rubble, craftsmen slaughtered or enslaved. Knowledge that had taken centuries to gather vanished in days of fire. The Mongols did not merely conquer, they reset history itself, leaving behind emptiness where culture had once flourished. For those trapped inside the sieges, the experience was something closer to nightmare than war. Food dwindled within weeks. Wells ran dry. Citizens drank water, fouled by disease, gnawed on bark, boiled leather into broth. Families huddled in cellars, while above them stones crashed and screams echoed through alleys. When the final breach came, many took their own lives rather than face what waited at the hands of the horsemen. And still, even in the midst of such devastation, the Mongols could be coldly pragmatic. Skilled artisans and engineers were spared, marched away in chains to serve in future campaigns. Populations who surrendered early were sometimes relocated rather than slaughtered, turned into tools of empire rather than obstacles. But for most, surrender or defiance made little difference. The siege ended with silence, and silence was all that remained. These sieges shook not only cities, but the very idea of civilization's permanence. For centuries, men had built upward, fortresses, towers, walled metropolises, believing height and stone would protect them. The Mongols revealed how fragile that dream was. Walls were not salvation, but invitations, challenges to be torn down. And when they fell, the world within them fell too. By the time the Mongols moved on, kingdoms that had once believed themselves eternal were broken, their capitals blackened ruins, their rivers poisoned, their people vanished into dust. Civilization itself seemed to shudder at the sight, as if the very earth had learned that nothing was safe, not even behind walls. The sieges were not just battles. They were warnings written in fire and bone, reminders that the empire of death could reach anywhere, that no stone stood firm when the horsemen gathered before it. And with every city that fell, the world learned the same lesson. Against the Mongols, civilization itself was a siege waiting to be broken. Civilizations are built with the illusion of permanence. Palaces rise in stone, laws are carved into tablets. Dynasties trace their bloodlines back through centuries, all to convince themselves that time cannot unmake what they have raised. Yet in the sweep of history, nothing is more fragile than a kingdom at the height of its glory. When the Mongols thundered across the world, that fragility was laid bare. Ancient powers thought unshakable, crumbled as easily as a clay jar struck by an iron hammer. The Khwarezmian Empire in Persia was among the first to learn this truth. Once a thriving dominion stretching from the Caspian Sea to the deserts of Central Asia, its rulers commanded trade routes, armies, and cities of splendor. In their markets, silk and spices mingled with jewels and manuscripts, wealth flowing in from every direction. Their pride was matched only by their confidence. What force could ever truly threaten such a realm? The Mongols answered with fire. It began with a caravan, an embassy sent by Genghis Khan to open trade and diplomacy. But suspicion twisted the gesture. The Khwarezmian governor accused the envoys of spying, executed some, and mutilated others before sending them back in disgrace. To most rulers, such an act might have sparked skirmishes along the borders, a clash of pride and honour. To the Mongols it was not an insult, but a death sentence. What followed was not war in the conventional sense, it was erasure. The Mongols swept into the Khwarezmian lands like a tide that had no retreat. Cities that had stood for centuries, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, were reduced to smoking craters. Chroniclers recall the invaders speaking almost casually as they set fire to mosques, as if dismantling the foundations of faith and power was no greater task than breaking wood for kindling. Bukhara, with its domes and minarets, was stormed and silenced. Samarkand, that jewel of the Silk Road, was stripped of life. Urgench resisted the longest and paid the heaviest price. Its population slaughtered in numbers so vast that even contemporaries, accustomed to blood, wrote of it with horror. The Khwarezmian Shah himself fled, abandoning his subjects, scurrying from stronghold to stronghold until he died in exile, a king without a kingdom. His empire, which had stretched proudly across deserts and rivers, vanished within a handful of years. But Persia was not alone. The Jin dynasty in northern China, a power that had stood for centuries, learned the same lesson. Their walls were high, their armies vast, and their rulers had faced enemies before. Yet they had never faced a storm that could break fortresses with patience, fire, and relentless will. The Mongols pressed them again and again until the dynasty's heartlands cracked apart. By the time the capital at Zhongdu fell, it was not merely a city in ruin, it was the collapse of an entire dynasty's confidence, its people scattered, its court driven south in desperation. To the west, the Kingdom of Georgia felt the hoofbeats on its mountains. For generations it had been a crossroads of faith and trade, perched proudly between east and west, its kings boasting of victories over Persians and Seljuks alike. But the Mongols were not an army to be fought in open fields. Their arrival was sudden, their onslaught overwhelming. Georgia's proud knights, armoured and defiant, were swept aside as if their steel meant nothing. Cities burned, nobles were dragged into captivity, and the kingdom that had once defied empires found itself bowing to the horsemen from the steppe. Even the Abbasid Caliphate, long weakened but still revered, trembled as the Mongol shadow lengthened toward Baghdad. Though its fall would come later, the knowledge that the storm was approaching stripped away the aura of invincibility that had surrounded it for centuries. The caliphs, heirs to a golden age, could not halt the tide any more than the Shahs of Khwarezm had. Everywhere, the Mongols exposed the fragility of order. Borders dissolved as if they were drawn in sand. Dynasties that had claimed divine favour fell like leaves in autumn. Temples and palaces, symbols of permanence, became rubble. The silence that followed their destruction was not just the silence of bodies, but the silence of history itself, for records, libraries, and monuments vanished in flames. And yet, amid the ashes, one truth became clear. The Mongols did not simply defeat kingdoms. They broke the very idea that kingdoms were eternal. They showed that wealth, walls, and armies were no defense against relentless hunger. The rulers who had thought themselves safe discovered that their crowns were made of paper, their thrones of dust. For those who survived, the lesson was unforgettable. Tales of the Khwarezmian Shah's flight spread across continents, a warning to every court and caravan. Samarkand's smouldering ruins whispered across the Silk Road, carried by merchants who dared to return. Zhongdu's fall echoed in the south of China, where rulers trembled behind their walls. The Mongols did not need to conquer every city to collapse kingdoms. Fear did half the work for them. The fall of these ancient realms was not just the loss of power, but the unravelling of worlds. Markets where traders once shouted fell silent. Domes that had touched the sky collapsed into dust. Bloodlines that had ruled for centuries ended in exile or obscurity. And with each collapse, the Mongol Empire grew, stretching like a shadow across mountains, rivers and deserts, until it seemed less a nation than a force of nature. In their wake, the ancient kingdoms became little more than memories, names whispered by survivors, ruins half buried by sand, bones bleaching under the sun. And as the Mongols pressed ever onward, the lesson became unshakable. Nothing, no matter how old or proud, was safe from the empire of death. The Silk Road had always been a ribbon of life. Along its dusty paths came caravans of merchants, leading camels heavy with silk, spices, and stories. From China to the Mediterranean, this network of trade bound together kingdoms, dynasties, and empires. It carried wealth, knowledge, and faith. To walk among its caravanserais was to step into a world where Persian poets, Arab scholars, Chinese artisans, and steppe nomads all crossed paths. But once the Mongols emerged from the east, that ribbon of life became a highway of death. When Genghis Khan unleashed his armies on the Khwarezmian Empire, caravans became the first to bleed. Cities that had once been hubs of commerce, Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur, were not merely captured, they were erased, and as they fell, the great arteries of the Silk Road choked on ash and silence. Where once there had been markets filled with laughter, bargaining and clinking coins, there was only the smell of smoke and the sound of scavengers picking through ruins. The Mongols understood something few conquerors ever had. Control the road, and you control the world. The Silk Road was more than geography. It was the lifeline of civilizations. Armies marched, but caravans fed them. Cities grew, but caravans sustained them. Religion spread, but caravans carried its scriptures. To seize those roots was to seize history itself. And so the Mongols carved their empire not only with arrows but with the systematic destruction of every rival power along the trade corridors. For merchants caught between worlds, survival was a gamble. Some were welcomed if they submitted quickly, their goods seized but their lives spared. Others were massacred, their caravans torched in the desert, their bones left to bleach along the roadside. Stories of entire trains of camels disappearing into silence spread like wildfire. Traders began to weigh not the profits of their journeys, but the likelihood of making it home alive. One caravan, remembered in whispers, travelled from the markets of Nishapur toward the west. Laden with silks, porcelain, and precious gems, it was a moving palace of wealth. Its guards carried banners. Its leaders wore robes of embroidered gold. But when the Mongols found it, they saw not merchants, but a target. The caravan was surrounded, its guards slaughtered, its goods divided among the riders. The survivors, merchants, servants, and children alike, were marched to a nearby city, only to be executed as a warning. The message was clear. Wealth was no shield, and no road was safe. And yet, even in destruction, the Mongols reshaped the Silk Road into something new. Where they destroyed kingdoms, they also imposed order. Once resistance was broken and submission extracted, the roads became strangely secure. Secure in the sense that caravans moved only under the shadow of Mongol rule. Bandits who had once preyed on merchants were exterminated, their lairs burned, their leaders hanged. Taxes were collected efficiently, tributes enforced ruthlessly. To travel beneath the banner of the Khan was to travel without fear of petty thieves, though always in fear of the empire itself. It was a paradox. The Mongols brought both annihilation and a strange kind of peace. Cities that resisted were wiped from the map, but cities that surrendered often found their markets reopened, now feeding the appetites of the empire. Caravans resumed their journeys, but their profits no longer flowed to kings or caliphs. They flowed into Mongol coffers. The Silk Road was not destroyed. It was transformed into the veins of an empire that thrived on both blood and gold, but the cost was staggering. Populations along the routes dwindled. Refugees streamed into deserts and mountains, seeking any escape from the storm. Fields lay untended, orchards unharvested, wells poisoned or abandoned. The very geography of the Silk Road changed as entire stretches of land became wastelands. Chroniclers tell of weeks of travel without encountering a single village, only empty houses where silence pressed harder than the sun. And yet, even as the Mongols turned trade routes into conduits of death, they also carried with them something else, an exchange far stranger than goods. With their conquests, ideas and technologies spread faster than ever before. Chinese engineers were forced westward, teaching the secrets of gunpowder and siegecraft. Persian astronomers found their way east, their knowledge absorbed into Mongol courts. The road was lined with corpses, but it was also the artery of cultural transmission. The Mongols were executioners, but they were also unwilling curators of a connected world. Still, for those who lived through it, this offered no comfort. Survivors remembered only the terror of hoofbeats in the distance, the sight of banners rising against the horizon, and the endless question of whether to resist or submit. For every city spared, a dozen were erased. For every caravan that passed in safety, countless others vanished into silence. The empire that emerged along the Silk Road was one fed by paradoxes, a peace that came from slaughter, an order that arose from ashes, a prosperity purchased with the ruin of ancient kingdoms. The Great Caravan of Death was not a single procession, but the living symbol of this truth. Wherever the Mongols rode, caravans followed, some willing, others enslaved, all moving under the weight of a new world. And as the empire spread, the Silk Road ceased to be a tapestry of many powers and became the backbone of one. From the Pacific shores of China to the plains of Hungary, from the deserts of Persia to the markets of Armenia, the same authority reigned. It was not the authority of kings or caliphs, but of a Khan whose word was law, whose wrath was annihilation, and whose riders turned the world's lifeline into their own dominion. For those who gazed upon the endless caravans of goods, captives, and soldiers moving under the Mongol banners, the image was unforgettable. It was the sight of a road that once carried life, now carrying death. It was the recognition that the world had been reordered, not by kings, not by priests, but by horsemen who saw empires as fragile toys and the Silk Road as their stage. And so, the Great Caravan of Death rolled ever onward, stretching across deserts, mountains and rivers, leaving in its wake not only the smoke of ruined kingdoms, but also the strange, uneasy silence of a world realizing it had been bound together by conquest. From the deserts of Central Asia to the rivers of China, kingdoms had already crumbled. Yet the storm was not content with one horizon. It pressed outward, a tide that reached across mountains, deserts, and seas, until the very map of the known world seemed to buckle beneath its shadow. For the Mongols, conquest was not bound by borders. Their empire stretched like smoke across 2 continents, covering lands so vast that no ruler, no matter how distant, could feel truly safe. In the east, the banners of Genghis Khan reached deep into China. The Jin dynasty's fortresses had fallen, their cities blackened, and now the rich heartlands of the Song dynasty lay exposed. The fertile plains of the Yangtze, where rice grew in abundance and cities bustled with merchants, became the next prize. Chinese records speak of panic spreading as whispers of Mongol devastation trickled southward. Walls were fortified, armies raised, but nothing could stop the memory of Zhongdu's fall. Even before the horsemen arrived, the fear of their coming was already a weapon. Yet while one wing of the Mongol horde moved deeper into Asia, another pushed westward. Beyond Persia, beyond the shattered Khwarezmian lands, stretched the Islamic heartlands of Mesopotamia and the caravan cities that linked them to the Mediterranean. And beyond those, Europe, a continent that had long believed itself removed from the chaos of the steppe. That illusion began to die when Mongol horsemen appeared at its borders. The invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire had scattered refugees in every direction, carrying stories of slaughter. Traders spoke of Samarkand's streets piled with corpses, of Nishapur's people buried under their own city, of rulers fleeing like beggars. These tales found their way into Europe, where kings and priests first dismissed them as exaggerations. But soon enough, reports arrived from their own frontiers. In 1223, on the steppes near the Khalkha River, European armies met the Mongols for the first time. Princes from Kiev and Rus, allied with steppe nomads, gathered their strength to repel the invaders. They outnumbered the Mongols and believed their heavy cavalry could shatter the riders from the east. Instead, the Rus met the same fate as Persia and China. The Mongols feigned retreat, drawing their enemies into pursuit, then turned and enveloped them with precision. Entire regiments were cut down, their commanders captured, humiliated, and executed. The princes of Rus returned not as victors, but as broken remnants, carrying with them the realization that Europe too had fallen under the Mongol shadow. In the years that followed, the Mongols returned to the west with greater force. Cities across the Caucasus were destroyed. Georgian lands were crushed again. Their kings reduced to tributaries. Armenia too was drawn into the orbit of Mongol dominance, its rulers left with little choice but submission. Everywhere the same pattern unfolded: resist and burn, submit and live in humiliation. The message spread like wildfire across the frontiers of Europe and the Middle East. The Mongols were not raiders, they were executioners. Even the great powers of Christendom began to tremble. Hungary heard rumours of their approach long before the horsemen reached its plains. The kingdom fortified castles, raised armies, and called upon God for protection. Yet when the Mongols came, they came with a speed that defied preparation. Towns were burned in days, villages emptied in hours. Chroniclers recorded fields littered with bones, rivers choked with the dead. The kingdom of Hungary, proud and strong, lay bleeding beneath the hooves of riders who had come from beyond the horizon. To the north, Poland fared no better. Its knights, clad in heavy armour, marched to face the invaders, only to be swept aside with the same ruthless tactics that had broken armies from China to Persia. The Battle of Legnica in 1241 became a grim reminder that even Europe's strongest warriors were powerless before the storm. Corpses littered the field, their banners trampled into the mud, while the Mongols rode onward, their momentum unstoppable. And yet, for all their ferocity, the Mongols were not conquerors for conquest's sake. They were builders of an empire stitched together by fear. On one side of the continent, Chinese cities were falling. On the other, European fortresses trembled. Between them lay the vast belt of Central Asia and the Middle East, where trade routes were seized, populations relocated, and kingdoms bent into tributaries. The Empire of Death became not just an army, but a network, a machine that could consumed and connected the world of world. But the scale of destruction carried with it another consequence: silence. Where once there had been the clamour of markets and the chants of prayer, there now lay wastelands. Ancient cities that had thrived for centuries stood hollow, their people erased, their knowledge lost in smoke. Entire stretches of land lay empty, depopulated by massacre or flight, the survivors scattered to corners of the earth. The Mongols had not merely crossed continents, they had carved wounds into them. To those who lived in Europe, the Mongols were no longer a distant legend, but a presence felt even in the stillness of the night. To those in Asia, they were no longer conquerors but masters, reshaping kingdoms into tools of their will. Across both continents, the shadow grew, until it seemed the very earth itself had been divided between two realities: lands the Mongols had already broken, and lands that waited in terror for their coming. The empire was not finished. It would press further, reaching Baghdad, battering the gates of the Song dynasty, scattering armies from Poland to Korea. But already, by the time their hoofbeats echoed across two continents, one truth had become inescapable. No realm was beyond their reach. No kingdom too ancient to fall. No continent too vast to escape the shadow of Genghis Khan's storm. In the wake of so much ruin, an empire emerged that seemed less forged than unearthed from the rubble. Cities reduced to embers became foundations. Roads littered with bones became pathways of conquest and commerce. The Mongols had not simply destroyed, they had rearranged the world in their own image, layering order atop devastation. What survived was no accident. It was moulded with the same ruthless precision that had levelled kingdoms. The empire stretched across a horizon so vast that the rising sun in China shone on the same dominion as the setting sun over the plains of Hungary. A single authority bound together lands that had never before imagined themselves connected. From the icy forests of Rus to the burning deserts of Persia, tribute flowed toward the heart of this dominion. The world that had once been fractured into kingdoms and rival dynasties was now a patchwork stitched with Mongol threads. But the stitching was coarse, and the needle was soaked in blood. In every province, the memory of conquest lingered like smoke. Survivors learned quickly what submission meant. Pay the tribute, obey the Khan, and live beneath a rule where mercy was rare and rebellion meant annihilation. The choice had been made clear in city after city. Those who bent the knee were absorbed, those who resisted were erased, their ashes scattered into the soil of the empire's foundations. Yet within this brutality lay a strange order. The Mongols, despite their reputation as destroyers, were meticulous administrators. They organised their empire with the same discipline they wielded on the battlefield. Governors were installed, taxes were standardised, and scribes documented every ounce of wealth squeezed from the conquered. Roads were patrolled by mounted messengers, carrying orders across distances that once would have taken months to traverse. The empire's arteries ran with speed and precision, the same qualities that had carried its armies to victory. Trade, too, flourished under this system of control. The Silk Road, once dangerous and fractured, now ran under the watchful eye of Mongol law. Caravans that had feared bandits now feared only the wrath of the empire should they break its rules. From China came silk, porcelain, and tea. From India, spices and gems. From the Middle East, glass and knowledge. From Europe, furs, silver, and artisans. The Mongols themselves demanded little in the way of culture or invention, but they opened corridors that allowed ideas to flow with unprecedented speed. Even as ashes smouldered in one city, manuscripts and technologies travelled safely across the empire, carried by the same riders who had once carried death. And yet, for all the efficiency, the foundations were soaked in suffering. Cities that had resisted were not merely punished, but eradicated. Fields lay untended, where peasants had been slain, canals clogged with the corpses of those who built them. Ancient centres of learning, from Nishapur to Merv, were gone, their libraries burned, their scholars silenced forever. To the Mongols, these were not losses but warnings, reminders etched into the landscape that no defiance would be tolerated. The empire's structure itself reflected this balance of order and terror. At its peak, it was divided into 4 great khanates, each ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan, yet all tied to the memory of his authority. In the east, the Yuan dynasty took root in China, where Mongol rulers styled themselves emperors over the most populous land on earth. In the heart of Asia lay the Chagatai Khanate, ruling over the steppes and trade hubs of Central Asia. To the southwest stretched the Ilkhanate, lording over Persia and the Middle East. And to the north, the Golden Horde cast its influence over the forests and rivers of Rus, demanding tribute from cities that still remembered their prince's defeat at the Kalka River. This division did not weaken the empire, it extended its shadow. Even separated, the Khanates carried the same logic. Submission meant survival, rebellion meant death. In every corner, the same stories repeated themselves, even if the accents and landscapes differed. Villagers paid their grain to Mongol tax collectors. Kings sent their daughters as wives to secure alliances. And markets bustled under the weight of new goods flowing through reopened roads. But beneath the surface, the scars remained. Where ancient civilizations had once thrived, silence spread. Irrigated farmlands in Persia turned back to desert as labourers were slaughtered. Entire towns along the Sirdaria and Oxus rivers vanished, remembered only in chronicles that lamented how swiftly they were erased. Europe, though never fully conquered, bore its own wounds. Fields burned in Hungary, ruined monasteries in Poland, ghost towns where villages once stood. The Mongols had stretched their dominion like a net across the world, but within its knots, countless voids opened where once there had been life. And still, the empire endured, because it was built on fear as much as it was on trade. Rulers who lived under Mongol rule had seen firsthand the alternative. Submission might bring humiliation, but resistance promised extinction. The skull pyramids of Nishapur, the flooded streets of Zhongdu, the massacres of Rus, all stood as monuments more effective than stone fortresses. In the Mongol world, memory itself became a weapon, ensuring obedience long after the armies had passed. In this strange balance of terror and prosperity, the empire found its rhythm. Roads that ran past fields of bones also carried silk and silver. Cities that had once resisted became vital trade hubs under Mongol governors. Kings who once plotted defiance now competed to send tribute. The empire was built on ashes, but from those ashes, it reshaped the known world. For the first time in history, Asia and Europe were bound together by a single system of rule. A merchant could set out from Venice and, with the right papers and bribes, travel all the way to China under the protection of Mongol law. The shadow was heavy, but beneath it, the old divisions of East and West blurred, stitched together by the threads of conquest. Still, the price of that unity remained visible in the ruins that dotted the landscape. Every flourishing market sat on top of a graveyard. Every road was paved with the memory of cities that had refused to yield. The Mongols had indeed built an empire, but it was an empire constructed not on thriving civilizations, but on the charred remains of those who had dared to resist. And so, across 2 continents, the world lived in a paradox. The age of the Mongols was both a time of unprecedented connection and of unparalleled destruction. It was an empire that thrived precisely because it had ground so many others into dust. A vast dominion raised upon the silence of the fallen. The thunder of hooves had passed. The shouting of men and clash of steel faded into memory. Where once the ground shook beneath armies, there remained only stillness, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Across vast distances, from the valleys of the Tigris to the walls of northern China, towns and cities sat like extinguished candles. The Mongols had come, taken what they wanted, left behind reminders etched not in monuments, but in absence. Survivors of those campaigns lived among ruins. Farmers walked past fields still charred from the torches of invaders, planting seeds in soil that had swallowed the bodies of their neighbours. Market squares, once filled with the bargaining noise of merchants, now echoed with emptiness. In some places, life returned slowly, hesitant, as if the earth itself doubted it was safe to grow again. In others, no return was possible. Entire populations had been swept away, leaving hollow streets where grass grew between stones. It was in this quiet aftermath that the true weight of Mongol conquest could be felt. Armies were terrifying in their speed and brutality, but their departure left behind an even more unsettling truth. What had been destroyed was not returning. Cities that had stood for centuries were now names only found in records. Canals that had fed generations of farmers lay clogged with rubble and silt, turning once fertile valleys into wastelands. The silence of these places was not the pause before recovery, it was finality. For those who remained, survival took new forms. Some bent beneath the new rulers, paying tribute with grain, livestock, or daughters sent as wives to Mongol officials. Others became wanderers, displaced from homes that no longer existed, carrying stories of fire and slaughter to places not yet touched by the storm. Entire cultures shifted under the shadow of this silence, reshaping themselves to fit within the boundaries of an empire that had made obedience the price of existence. The Mongols themselves did not dwell on the ruins. To them, the storm was not senseless destruction, but a cleansing of obstacles. What stood in their way had been swept aside, and what remained was more pliable, easier to control. Administrators filled the spaces where generals had once stood, tallying taxes and assigning duties. Roads that crossed lands of ashes now carried messengers and caravans, guarded by the same authority that had brought devastation. Order replaced chaos, but it was an order haunted by memory. In many regions, whispers filled the silence. Old songs that once celebrated kings now mourned them. Tales of vanished cities spread like smoke, shaping the way people looked at their conquerors. Fear lingered long after the riders had gone, a fear that ensured obedience more effectively than swords. Every smouldering ruin spoke louder than decrees. Every pile of bones was a warning carved into the landscape itself. Resist, and you will join them. Yet silence was not only absence, it was also the stage upon which new exchanges unfolded. With roads secured and borders flattened, merchants dared to cross lands they had once feared. From Venice, travellers set out eastward, their journeys made possible by Mongol order. From the steppes, riders carried news, goods, and sometimes plague across distances that once divided the world. The storm had scattered lives, but in its wake, threads of connection were pulled tighter. Still, for many, the quiet felt unnatural, as though the world itself had been muted. Cities that had once been centres of learning no longer echoed with scholars' debates. Libraries that had housed generations of thought now existed only in memory. Where music once spilled from temples or marketplaces, the only sound was the wind moving through broken stones. Life continued, but it continued in the shadow of what had been lost, a daily existence intertwined with grief. Generations born after the conquests grew up in this silence, knowing the Mongols not only as destroyers, but as rulers. To them, stories of fire and slaughter came from their elders' lips, half warning and half memory. They lived in a world reshaped, where the absence of ancient kingdoms was as normal as the presence of Mongol law. The storm had passed, but its silence became the atmosphere in which they breathed. Even the conquerors themselves were touched by this quiet aftermath. Their empire was vast, but it was also fragile, stretched across distances no dynasty had ever ruled before. Beneath the surface order, the silence of conquered lands was not always submission, but exhaustion, the stillness of peoples too broken to resist, yet too scarred to forget. The Mongols had unified the world through terror, but they could not erase memory. And so the silence endured, not merely the absence of sound, but the weight of consequences. It was in the deserted towns, the dry canals, the unmarked graves. It was in the way peasants lowered their eyes when tax collectors rode by. It was in the stories mothers told their children before sleep, cautionary tales whispered in low voices about the horsemen who once came with fire. The storm had made the world smaller, binding lands together under a single dominion. But the silence after the storm revealed what had been lost in the process. It was not a silence that promised peace, nor one that invited hope. It was a silence that reminded every survivor that the Mongols had come, and that their shadow lingered, even in the stillness. And so our story drifts to its quiet end. Tonight we walked across the steppe, where silence and wind carried the weight of an empire. We followed the shadows of horsemen who turned hunger into strength, betrayal into survival, and silence into storms that consumed nations. We saw how the earth itself shaped them, and how 40 million lives were scattered like ashes across the world. But beyond the numbers, beyond the endless wars, lies a question worth holding on to. What does it mean when survival demands the price of so many others? The Mongols built something vast, yet fragile, something remembered not by monuments of stone, but by the emptiness left behind. So I want to ask you, what stayed with you most from this journey? Was it the silence of the grasslands, the cruelty of betrayal, the storm of conquest, or the haunting quiet that followed it all? Share your thoughts below. Each answer is like another small voice joining this echo of history, and together we keep the story alive in a gentler way. If you've been listening until now, perhaps even drifting towards sleep as the past unfolded, don't forget to subscribe before you go. It helps these stories travel a little further, finding others who, like you, seek a quieter way to meet history. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. Sleep well, and until next time, may the silence of the steppe rest softly with you.